They say a father's dream is to build something his children can inherit. For me, that dream started in a rented garage in Birmingham, Alabama. I didn't have investors or fancy degrees, just grit, grease, and a little boy who followed me around, calling me boss. That boy grew up to be my pride, sharp, confident, ambitious. Together, we built Henderson Logistics from one pickup truck to a full regional fleet. I thought I was teaching him about hard work and loyalty. Turns out he was taking notes on control. The day my own son called me into the boardroom, told me the company needed younger leadership, I felt something snap. But I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I just looked at him and smiled, because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't taking back what you built. It's walking away and watching them realize what they lost. You ever wake up one day and realize that everything you are came from one decision you made years ago? For me, that moment came at 50 years old, sitting in the break room of a factory I'd worked in for half my life, staring down at a pink slip that told me it was all over. Restructuring, they called it, a polite way of saying they didn't need me anymore. I remember walking out of that place for the last time, the smell of oil and steel still on my hands, the sound of machines buzzing behind me. I didn't have a plan, not really, just a beat-up toolbox, a 20-year-old pickup truck, and a boy at home who looked at me like I could fix anything in the world. His name was Darius, my only son. He was 14 then, tall, sharp, full of questions, always asking how things worked, always following me around like a shadow. That night, we sat on the porch together. He noticed I was quiet. "You okay, Pop?" he asked. I told him, "I'm fine, son, just thinking." And I was thinking about how I'd given half my life to someone else's dream, how I'd traded my time and strength to build machines that didn't carry my name. I made a promise that night, not out loud, just deep inside. I wasn't going to work for anyone else again. Whatever came next, it was going to have my name on it. The next morning, I woke up early and went out to the garage. I looked around that dusty little space, barely big enough for 2 cars, and saw something more. Not a garage, a beginning. I started small, fixing engine for neighbors, doing tune-ups, towing old trucks from junkyards. I charged just enough to keep the lights on, but I worked like every job mattered. After a while, word spread. Folks in town started saying, "If you want a truck fixed right, take it to Henry." That was all I needed. A few good words and a lot of long nights. Darius started helping after school. He'd hand me wrenches, hold the flashlight, and ask 100 questions. "Why you do it that way, Pop? How come the engine shakes like that?" I'd explain as best I could, trying to teach him not just about bolts and parts, but about pride. If you're going to put your name on something, I'd tell him, you make sure it's done right. He'd nod every time, taking in like scripture. I used to look at him and think, maybe this kid's the reason I lost that job. Maybe God was clearing space for us to build something together. A few years later, I scraped together enough to buy an old box truck, rust on the sides, engine barely holding on. But to me, that truck looked like a dream with wheels. We started small deliveries, lumber, parts, local shipments. Darius rode shotgun on weekends, notebook in hand, keeping track of every job. I can still see him in that passenger seat, his face lit up by the dashboard glow, talking about how one day we'd have a whole fleet with our name on the side. "Henderson Logistics," he said, like he could already see it. "Sounds big, doesn't it, Pop?" I smiled, tired as I was, and said, "It does, son. It really does." We worked like that for years, through rain, through winters, through nights when I fall asleep at the desk doing invoices. There wasn't much glamour in it, just long hours and hope. But the funny thing about hard work, it has a way of growing roots before you even notice. Our little business started getting real clients. One led to another. The old truck turned into 2, then 3. I hired a couple of drivers, some of the men I used to work with at the factory. It felt good giving folks jobs instead of waiting for someone else to hand one to me. Darius grew up right in the middle of it all. When he wasn't in school, he was out there with me, learning every inch of the business. He was sharper than I ever was. He could fix an engine and handle paperwork before he was 18. I told him, "You're going to take this farther than I ever could." He'd laugh and say, "We're going to take it, Pop. You and me." I liked the sound of that. You and me. There were nights when we'd stop at some roadside diner after delivery, grease still on our hands, laughing about the things that went wrong that day. Flat tires, bad coffee, rude customers. I'd watch him talk about his plans for future, and I'd feel this quiet pride, like maybe all those years of sacrifice were worth it. When he went off to college, I'll admit it was hard. The house felt empty without the sound of him coming in and out of the garage. But every Sunday he'd call. He'd tell me about business classes, how they were teaching him new ways to grow what we started. He said, "Pop, when I get back, I'm going to help you take this thing nationwide." Those calls were my favorite part of the week. While he was gone, I kept the business running, just enough to keep the wheels turning until he came home. I missed him, but I knew he was chasing something good, and I was proud that he still saw our company as ours. When graduation day came, I drove up to university. Seeing him walk across that stage in his cap and gown, man, I can't even describe it. My chest hurt, in a good way. All I could think was, "That's my boy." After the ceremony, he came up and hugged me. "We did it, Pop," he said. "We really did it." On the drive home, he talked about new ideas, new ways to run things smarter. Contracts, investors, marketing. He was fired up. I didn't understand half of it, but I didn't need to. I just liked seeing him dream. The next few months, we worked side by side again, like old times, only now he was the one teaching me. I watched him set up computers, negotiate deals, talk to people twice his age with confidence. It was something to see. One evening, we stood in front of our new office, a small building with our name printed on the glass door, Henderson Logistics, LLC. The letters gleamed in the sunset. I remember reaching into my pocket and pulling out a single key, the one to the first truck we ever bought. I handed it to him. "This started it all," I said. "Now it's yours." He looked down at it, quiet for a second, then smiled. "I'll make you proud, Pop." I told him, "You already have?" We stood there for a while, neither of us saying much. The hum of the city in the distance, the smell of diesel and fresh paint, the sound of a future opening up. I thought that was the happiest moment of my life. Watching my boy hold that key, watching him carry the dream we built from nothing. I didn't know, standing there in that golden light, that I was handing him more than just a key. I was handing him control, power he'd one day use to push me out. But that part of the story comes later. For now, I remember the laughter, the long nights, the smell of motor oil and rain. I remember two hands, mine and his, passing that key between us, both of us believing it meant forever. And maybe in a way it still did, just not in the way I expected. You know that feeling when something you built starts to grow faster than you expected? It's a strange mix, pride in one breath and a little vertigo in the next. That's how it was for me in those years after Darius came back from college. We went from a few trucks rattling down county roads to a fleet with routes across 3 states. People we'd once handed flyers to at the depot were now signing contracts, and the name Henderson Logistics began showing up on invoices and stickers on the side of our trucks. It looked good. It felt good. I told myself it was a dream coming true. Darius had this way with people. He could stand in front of a room full of strangers and make them feel like they'd always belonged. He learned to move in boardrooms and at fancy lunches, talking about efficiency metrics and cloud tracking systems. I remember watching him from the doorway of our little office, arms folded, feeling a mix of admiration and something like worry that I didn't put a name to right away. He brought ideas I wouldn't have thought of, software that tracked shipments down to the minute, a branded logo that turned our trucks from plain metal boxes into moving billboards. He pushed for a website and a social media page, the sort of things I'd never spent time on when I was tightening bolts at midnight. He talked to investors with confidence that used words like scalability and ROI. I would listen with a cup of coffee in my hand, nodding when I could, asking him to slow down when the talk drifted into numbers that moved too fast for me. "Dad, we can use telematics to cut fuel costs," he'd say. We can bid on larger contracts if we can prove real-time tracking. He'd show me projections on his laptop, neat rows of figures and bright graphs that climbed like steps to somewhere I wanted to be. I'd point to the screen and say, "Show me how it works." He'd smile and explain it in plain language, and I'd feel that familiar warmth, the same as we was 14 listening to me explain how an engine put power to the road. Different kind of learning, same look of pride. The business changed quickly. We moved out of that cramped office with a cracked linoleum into a glossier building with glass doors and a nameplate. The new office smelled like new carpet and polish. It had a receptionist who wore crisp blouses and a conference room with a table that could seat a dozen. The first time I walked into that conference room, I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. But Darius was there beside me, and for a moment, everything felt like it had always been meant to be. We hired people I didn't know, a logistics manager from the city, a marketing person who spoke in 3-syllable words about brand equity. Board meetings started to happen. Darius invited clients to dinners and restaurants with white tablecloths. I was proud of him the way a father is proud to see his child find their stride. But what I hadn't expected was how different the language of success could feel. The things they talked about, shareholder value, pivot strategies, growth rounds, were not the same language I'd learned in the garage or on the road. I listened mostly, and I tried to learn. At first, the new faces were a curiosity. Men and women in suits who knew how to read contracts and wore watches that told more than the time. They complimented Darius on his vision and on our numbers. "You've built an impressive operation," one man said to me at a ribbon cutting. "Clinking a glass. Solid foundation." I smiled and told the story of how the business started with one old truck and a lot of stubbornness, and their faces were polite. Darius's hand found mine in the crowd for a second, a small, quiet anchor, but there was also a subtle shift in how decisions were made. Where it used to be the two of us sitting at a folding table counting receipts, now there were memos and presentations. Meetings were scheduled at times that fit the board members, and sometimes I wasn't called in for the ones in the morning that started with coffee and financial models. Darius would come back from those mornings with a briefcase and a new phrase to explain his absence. Investor calls ran late, Pop. We had to lock it down. He'd ruffle my hair like he had when he was a kid and say, "It's progress." Progress, I told myself, was what this was, and maybe that helped me swallow the small discomforts. I wanted him to have the space to grow. He'd given up nights and weekends to learn parts of the business I didn't have the patience for. He had degrees in technology and a way with numbers that made bankers nod. If that meant boardrooms full of unfamiliar faces, so be it. I'd made this for him. After all, I wanted him to use every tool he had. There were moments, though, when I walked into a room and felt like I'd missed the first chapter of a book. A conversation would be underway when I sat down, full of acronyms and jargon. Men would exchange looks that I didn't quite read. Someone would introduce me as Henry Henderson, founder, and they'd smile politely, but the way they asked about my role felt like more of a ceremonial nod than an invitation to contribute. I'd offer a thought for my years on the road, something practical about routes or drivers, and the room would shift to projections on the screen, as if my experience belonged in a different corner of the conversation. One afternoon, after a meeting about fleet expansion, I walked past a break room and overheard a talk between two executives. "We need a younger leadership face for the next round," one said. "Investors want to see a dynamic CEO who's tech forward." I felt my chest tighten. My first reaction was to get defensive, to march right in and tell them where to put their projections. Then I remembered the early days, the hard lessons, the nights when Darius and I were too tired to laugh. I stepped back and told myself to be patient. After all, if they were talking about growth, that meant opportunity. For a moment, nobody said a word. The man in the suit cleared his throat again, pushing the folder closer to me. "This outlines your transition package, Mr. Henderson. We're offering a very generous retirement plan and continued equity stake. You'll always be part of the company in spirit." In spirit, that line hit me harder than I expected. They were already talking about me like I was gone, like I was a photograph they'd frame and hang on a wall somewhere, under good lighting, right before they forgot I existed. I glanced at Darius. He couldn't even meet my eyes. His jaw tightened like a man who'd practiced the speech too many times. His voice was soft when he finally said, "It's not personal, Dad. It's business." And that's when something inside me broke. Quietly, like glass under a blanket. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the folder for a long time before I finally spoke. "That's exactly the problem, son," I said. "You stopped seeing the difference between the two." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the clicking of someone's pen at the far end of the table. Every face around me was trying not to look guilty. I thought about all the nights we'd spent in that old garage, both of us covered in grease and laughter. The times we'd driven cross-country in that first truck, eating fast food and dreaming about a future neither of us could picture yet. I thought about that day I'd hand him the key. My hand steadied his trembling, and the promise I felt in that moment, the one that said, "This will be ours forever." And now here we were, boardroom suits, polished glass, my own son sitting across from me, telling me in the language of business that there was no more ours. I picked up the pen they'd placed beside the papers. My hand didn't shake, not once. I flipped to the page with my name and stared at the words, "Retirement Agreement." It looked too formal for something that felt this personal. "You know," I said, still looking at the paper, "I used to tell your mama that you were the best thing I ever built. Not the company. You." Darius's face twitched, a flicker of emotion, gone before it fully showed. I signed the papers. One signature. That's all it took to erase decades of sweat, sacrifice, and memory. When I pushed the folder back across the table, I noticed how quiet my voice sounded when I said, "Congratulations, Mr. CEO." He looked up at me then, eyes glistening but steady. I could tell he wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe just an explanation, but the moment had already passed. I stood up, straightening my jacket, feeling years of weight settle somewhere deep in my chest. "You built something good here, son," I said. "Just don't forget where you learned how." Then I turned and walked out. No slamming doors. No shouting. Just the soft sound of my shoes against the polished floor. The same floor we'd once carried boxes across together, back when the company still smelled like oil and effort instead of perfume and polish. As I reached the hallway, I paused for just a second. Through the glass wall, I could see Darius still sitting there, staring down at the table. His hand was covering the spot where my signature had just gone. He didn't look triumphant. He looked small. That's the part no one ever talks about. How betrayal doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes dressed in love that's lost its way. I walked out of that building into the bright Alabama sun, blinking hard against it. The air felt too clean, too quiet. My car was parked where it always was, same dented pickup I'd driven since the early days. I sat inside for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slow. I thought I'd feel anger, but what I felt instead was empty, like a room after the furniture has been moved out. After a while, I started the engine and drove away. No destination in mind, just roads stretching out in front of me like open wounds. As I passed the last delivery truck pulling out the company lot, my trucks still bearing the Henderson name, I gave a small nod. Let them have it, I thought. The name, the company, the empire, let them all have it. Because sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's survival. That was the day I stopped being the man who built Henderson Logistics. That was the day I became Henry Henderson again, just a man with two good hands, a quiet heart, and a story that wasn't finished yet. And though I didn't know at the time, that empty space I drove into would become the very place where peace and a different kind of revenge would start to grow. When the door to the boardroom closed behind me that day, the sound of it felt like a punctuation mark, simple and final. For the first week or two after, I hardly left the house. I'd sit in the living room surrounded by the things that used to mean success. Framed articles with our picture, the ribbon-cutting photo where Darius and I were both smiling, little plaques from community groups thanking us for donations. They looked the same as they always did, but the light that used to make them proud now just showed edges and dust. I stopped answering most calls. I let the phone go to voicemail and watched the number of messages pile up like small, unanswered questions. Friends checked in at first, hesitant. like they weren't sure they should step over a line. I could hear the care in their voices, but hearing them made it worse in a way. It reminded me of the meetings, the polite smiles, the "we wish you the best" type of sympathy. I wasn't ready for sympathy. I didn't need to be fixed. I needed to find out who I was without a company letterhead. There was a Bible on the side table, my wife's Bible. She'd been gone several years by then, but she left little things behind that the years hadn't been able to take. Tucked inside the pages where she last read was a folded scrap of paper in her handwriting. "Don't let your work be your worth." I stared at that line until the edges of the letters blurred. It was the kind of note she would leave, gentle, practical, like a hand on your shoulder. I thought about those words a lot. At first, they felt like something she'd said to comfort me after losing a job, something she'd tell me when I got too wound up in a worry. But the more I read it, the more it sounded like a commandment I had been trying to learn my whole life. Don't let your work be your worth. It implied that worth could be something separate, something quieter than a company name on a truck. The house felt huge and oddly private without Darius coming in and out with lists and plans. The silence used to be heavy, like a weight pressing on the chest. But after a while, the weight started to change shape. It stopped feeling like emptiness and began to feel like a room I could walk around in without tripping. I started taking small walks, first just down the block, then a little farther. I would pass the old garage where it all began and stand for a moment just looking at it. The flaking paint, the sagging door, the one rusted sign that still said Henderson in faded letters. That place smelled like early mornings and the grease of honest labor. It smelled like beginnings. Walking past the warehouse, I'd watch the drivers load up the trucks, and I'd feel something like gratitude for the work that still went on. The company was hum, routine, movement. It had a life of its own now that didn't require my hands. Watching from a distance hurt and healed at the same time. Sometimes I'd sit on a bench near the depot and let the world move by me. People I'd known for years would nod. Some would come over to talk for a minute. I didn't have many long conversations. Mostly I listened. At home, I found myself doing things I hadn't made time for in years. I fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen instead of calling someone. I cleaned out the junk drawer where old maintenance receipts and a box of matches had lived for decades. Little hands-on tasks that used to be delegated to mechanics or supervisors were my solace now. There's something grounding about turning a wrench, about feeling a bolt give and knowing you've done the work clean. Work that feeds the soul doesn't need a boardroom to validate it. Sometimes I take out the old notebooks I kept from those first years. Scraps of invoices, names of clients written in pencil, doodles of routes I'd planned on napkins. There were names and their drivers I'd helped when times were lean, and addresses where men were waiting the cold to load a truck. Those pages smelled like coffee in the road. I'd trace the handwriting and remember the rhythm of it. Early mornings, the smell of diesel, the crook of a hand steering a tired wheel. It reminded me that a life is built from small, ordinary things more than big ceremonies. Neighbors I'd known for years began to stop by more often, not to talk about business, but to talk about their lives. One afternoon, old Joe from the corner gas station dropped off a bag of peaches and sat on my porch steps telling stories about his boyhood. Another time, a young woman I'd taught to change a tire came by to ask if I'd help her son with science project. People began to seek the man, not the title. It surprised me how comforting that was. I went back to the garage one morning, not to work on trucks, but to clean up. The place had been left as it was for me to return to, a sort of shrine at times. I wiped down the workbench where Darius and I used to spread maps and invoices. I found a box of old tools my father had given me when I first started. The handles were worn smooth by use. I picked up an old wrench and felt the curve of it fit like an old friend in my palm. There's a sound to a tool when it's been used well, a small, low music of metal and hands. I listened to that music and felt something close to peace. At night, I would sit by the kitchen window with the Bible on my lap, reading small passages that I used to read with my wife. Her handwriting was in the margins, little notes about the page. I read the same lines she had circled and imagined her voice saying them. It was like being cut by a hand I trusted. Her note about worth didn't feel like a reprimand anymore. It felt more like a guidepost I'd missed when the whole world was loud and bright. People called. Sometimes. Darius's number flashed across my phone, and I let it ring out too often. I'd listen to his message later if I felt ready. Updates on routes, a question about a maintenance schedule, a clipped hello that ended without asking me how I was. It hurt me to hear how small my place had become in the cadence of his day. But with every unanswered call, the space between us grew more obvious and less aching. I was learning to breathe inside that space. My days began to take a slow, steady shape. Morning walks led to coffee at the diner, where the men in caps would nod and tell me about their grandkids. I kept a small routine of checking in on the older drivers who still came to me for advice. I stopped being offended when they asked questions I would have answered. There was a humility in being asked again that I hadn't felt in years. It was as if the world had given me permission to be myself without the company logo taped to my chest. One afternoon, a kid from down the street came by looking for a favor. His bicycle chain had snapped, and he'd heard I could fix anything. He stood with his hands shoved in his pockets, a bit ashamed. I took the bike into the garage, sat him down, and showed him how to put the chain back on and how to oil it so it wouldn't rust. The boy watched every move like it was a lesson in magic. When he left, he waved and said, "Thanks, Mr. Henry. You're like the man who fixes everything." I laughed and told him not to get carried away. But inside, I felt the warmth of being needed, not for my resume or my title, but for the simple knowledge of how to make things right. There were evenings when the house felt too full of trophies and quiet, and on those nights I'd drive with no destination, just a move. I'd take the long road by the river, where the trees lined up like patient witnesses. The water would glint in the moonlight, and the hum of the truck would calm my thoughts. One night, I pulled over, sat on the hood, and watched the stars, thinking about the life I'd built. I thought of my father's hands, of my wife's laugh, of Darius's first step into that old truck. I thought about that scrap of paper wedged in a Bible and how a few words could be a map. Slowly, silence stopped being punishment and started being possibility. I began to see room in it, room for a different rhythm, room for small things that grew roots. The silence gave me time to remember what I liked when no one was looking. Fixing an engine, calling a neighbor to see if they needed help, teaching a boy how to read a tire pressure gauge. Those things felt honest. They felt like me. And though I didn't know yet exactly what I would do next, I could feel the first stirring of a plan that had nothing to do with boardrooms or investors. It was quieter than that, built of hands and days and small repairs. The silence after the storm wasn't empty. It was the first room of a house I had yet to build for myself. Starting over at 63 wasn't something I ever planned on doing, but the funny thing about life is, it doesn't care much for your plans. It just hands you new roads, and you either drive them or let them pass by. It happened quietly, the way all real beginnings do. One morning, I was walking past an old service station by the highway, the kind of place with peeling paint and a single leaning gas pump that hadn't worked in years. The sign was faded, the windows dusty, but I could see the bones of it. Something about that small, forgotten building spoke to me. It reminded me of the garage where I'd started all those years ago. Only this time, I wasn't trying to build an empire. I just wanted something honest, something mine. I stood there for a long time, running my hand along the chipped metal of the garage door. I could almost hear the echo of engines, the laughter of the boys who used to work beside me, the clank of tools in a drawer. It felt like the sound of home. A week later, I signed a lease. It didn't look like much at first. A cracked floor, a stubborn door that needed a shoulder to open, and a smell of old oil that no amount of fresh air could chase away. But it was good. Real good. It was mine. I bought a few second-hand tools, dragged in an old workbench, and spent the first few weeks just fixing the place up. My hands were sore, but in a way that made me feel alive again. I painted the walls, replaced the lights, patched the leaks in the roof, and set a small radio on a shelf that played blues in the background. It was peaceful, just me and the hum of work. Word started getting around faster than I expected. A couple of old drivers who'd worked for Henderson Logistics stopped by when they saw the open sign. They came in grinning, shaking their heads. "Boss," one of them said, laughing, "didn't think I'd ever see you under a hood again." I chuckled. Didn't think I'd be under one again either. They hung around that day, telling stories about the old routes, the long nights, the trucks that gave us trouble but somehow kept running. I fixed one of their rigs for free, just because I wanted to. It wasn't about the money. It was about connection. Before long, more folks started coming. Drivers on long hauls would pull off the highway when they saw my sign. Neighbors stopped by just to talk, or to ask me to look at their lawnmowers, their kids' bikes, whatever needed a little help. I didn't turn anyone away. Work was work, and people were people. I started taking on a few young men from the area, boys who needed direction, or just someone to believe in them for a while. They reminded me of Darius, in a way, bright, eager, but still learning where to put their ambition. One of them, a skinny kid named Malik, showed up one afternoon with hands too clean to trust and a nervous look in his eyes. "I heard you used to run a company," he said. I smiled, wiping my hands on a rag. "I used to run a lot of things. Now I just fix what's broken." He didn't laugh at that, but he stayed, started sweeping the floor, watching how I worked, asking questions that made me think. Over time, he learned how to change oil, tighten belts, and rebuild small engines. He was clumsy at first, most of them are, but he stuck with it. And every time he got something right, that look of pride crossed his face, the same one Darius used to wear. We worked side by side, just like I had with my own boy years ago. Only this time, I didn't rush. I let silence fill the space between words. I didn't just teach the craft. I tried to teach what the years had taught me. Patience, care, and the truth that dignity doesn't come from money or titles. It comes from the way you do a thing when no one's watching. By spring, the shop had a rhythm, the kind that settles into your bones and feels like peace. Morning started with coffee and the smell of gasoline, and by noon the sound of engines mixed with the laughter of people coming and going. "Boss!" They'd call me when I stepped out front, same way they did back in the logistics days. The name felt different now, lighter somehow. Back then, boss meant responsibility, pressure, and numbers. Now it just meant respect, the kind you earn not because of what you own, but because of who you are. One afternoon, I caught myself standing by the open garage door, wiping grease off my hands and watching the sun dip behind the trees. Malik was working on an old truck, humming along to the radio. The air smelled like oil and sawdust and something sweet from the diner down the road. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. I realized that the dream hadn't died when I walked out of that boardroom. It had just changed shape. It wasn't about fleets and expansions anymore. It was about legacy, but not the kind written in company reports or investor memos. The kind that lives in the hands of the people you teach, in the small kindnesses you leave behind. Sometimes, old customers would stop by just to talk. One of them, Big Ray, a man with a beard white as snow, leaned against the doorway one day and said, "You know, Henry, it's good seeing you like this. You look lighter." I smiled, thinking about it. Guess I finally learned to let go of the load I wasn't meant to carry forever. He nodded, like he knew exactly what I meant. That night, after closing, I sat on the bench outside the shop. The sky was painted in deep oranges and purples, and the sound of crickets hummed low. I thought about my wife again, her note, and those words she'd written. "Don't let your work be your worth." It took me years to understand what she meant. Maybe this small, quiet life was a lesson. Sometimes people think revenge means payback, showing the world what it lost when it lost you. But sitting there under that fading sky, I realized revenge can be as simple as peace. To live well, to find your rhythm again, that's the kind of revenge that doesn't need to be announced. Malik came out just as the streetlights flickered on. "You heading home, boss?" "Yeah," I said, standing up slow. "You lock up." He nodded. "Already did." "Good man," I said, patting his shoulder. "Keep that up." As we walked to our cars, I looked back at the little shop, the lights glowing warm inside, tools neatly hung, the Henderson Repair sign I'd painted by hand swinging gently in the breeze. It wasn't much by the world's measure, but to me, it was everything. That night, when I got home, I turned off my phone, made a simple dinner, and sat by the window with my coffee. The world outside was quiet. soft. I didn't think about what I'd lost anymore. I thought about what I'd built twice now and how, somehow, it all led me here. I wasn't chasing millions anymore. Just mornings that started easy and nights that ended in peace. A road that was mine alone, with no one to answer to and no one to disappoint. And deep down, I knew something else too, that this new road, this quiet chapter, was just the beginning of something even more meaningful. Because sometimes you have to lose everything you thought mattered just to find what actually does. When Darius walked through that shop door months later, I almost didn't recognize the slump in his shoulders. He'd been the kind of man who filled a room with plans. Now he moved like someone carrying wet blankets. His suit was rumpled at the collar. His shoes had seen a few long nights, and there was a tiredness around his eyes that made him look smaller than the boy who once sat in my passenger seat with a notebook. For a second, I thought of the old trucks he used to climb into without hesitation, how they looked the same after a long haul. But the driver comes back different. He stood there, hands buried in his pockets, like he wasn't sure where to begin. The radio on the shelf hummed something lazy and slow. Malik was under the hood of a customer's pickup, humming along with the tune, and looked up as Darius came in. "Hey, Mr. Henderson," he said with a nod. "Big man back in town." Darius managed a small, crooked smile at that. He walked toward me, and for a moment we just looked at each other the way men do when they don't know which of the old words still apply. "Pop," he said finally, like a child calling his father home after being gone too long. I poured 2 cups of coffee, the same brand we'd always had in the shop, and handed him one. He wrapped his hands around it like it was an anchor. He inhaled deep as if the steam was a bomb. "I'm sorry," he said, the words falling out like loose tools. "I didn't understand how much you carried. I thought I was helping. I didn't see the work behind the work." He sat on the bench like a man too tired to stand. The confession came without a demand for forgiveness. It was more like a man finally stepping into a room he'd avoided and deciding to stop hiding. I listened to him talk about missed calls, about investors pulling back, about drivers leaving because the company tried to run like a machine instead of like people. He spoke in the clipped language of board meetings, but there was something raw underneath it now, a crack where pride had been. I could have said 100 things. I could have reminded him of the nights I'd stayed up patching a truck, the loans I'd taken, the second mortgage I'd worried over. I could have told him about the small mercies, the times I covered a driver's medical bill, the nights I slept in the office to make sure a delivery went out on time. All those details are lodged in me like old screws that hold a frame together. But the truth of it is, words are often just echoes. Actions, quiet ones, can mean more. So I wiped my hands on a rag, like I was finishing a job, and poured him more coffee. "Sit," I said. "Tell me what you really need." He stared into his cup for a while, then looked up. I don't even know," he admitted. I thought the answer was more growth, more deals, more recognition. But the trucks are down more than they're up. Drivers are quitting for greener pay. There are leaks in places I didn't learn to look. His voice cracked. He looked like a boy again. I thought of the first truck we hauled, how its engine sputtered but kept going, because we kept feeding it what it needed. "You built with the right parts," I told him quietly. "But you can't run what you don't understand. You can't manage people with only spreadsheets. You've got to know the hum in the wheels. You've got to know when a man needs a word more than a wage." He swallowed, and there were tears now that made him look cleansed in some way. "I know," he said. "I've been calling all the wrong people, trying to fix the wrong things." We talked for a long time. Not the kind of talk that rearranges contracts, but the kind that untangles knotted ropes. He told me about shareholders and short-term goals and a board that had its eye on next quarter's numbers instead of next year's people. I told him about drivers who'd worked through snowstorms for us, about the man who'd taught me how to patch a tire in the rain, about the slow work of teaching someone to be reliable. It wasn't a lecture. It was a passing on of what's been learned the hard way. He listened like a man learning to hear again. At some point, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "I didn't come for a fight," he said. "I came because I want to learn. I thought I could do it without you. I was wrong." He pushed the envelope toward me. Inside was a shareholder report, numbers and projections, and an admission that things were worse than they'd let on. I did not look at it like a judge. I looked at it like a map of a place we once knew, now a little unsteady. "Sit down here," I said, tapping the stool beside me. I asked him questions about routes and maintenance schedules and driver retention. He answered in halting bursts, and then, slowly, his words steadied. We sketched ideas on an old envelope. A return to hands-on inspections, a ride-along routine so leadership could see the routes, a budget for driver welfare that wasn't just lip service. None of it was glamorous. None of it was a magic wand. But it was honest. It was the work I'd built my life on. When he left that afternoon, he hugged me like a man trying to hold together a history and a future. He didn't make promises bigger than he could keep. He simply said, "I'll start again, Pop, the right way." And when he walked out, he looked lighter, not free of mistakes, but free of a need to pretend he had no part in them. I watched him go and then set about closing the shop. Malik swept the floor. The radio played low, and the sun slipped down toward the horizon like it was washing the day clean. I looked at the tools hung neatly on the pegboard, the oil-stained rags, the faded sign above the door. All of it felt like proof that a life would be repaired, even after it had been dented and bent. I thought about revenge in the quiet way men think about it when they're older. That old notion of payback seems small now. It feels cheap. Real revenge, if you want to call it that, is something else. It's the slow work of rebuilding yourself so well that the people who thought they'd taken you down can't help but notice you're standing taller than before. It's living without rawness and without spite. It's being proof that a life is more than a title on a door. That evening I locked up the shop and stood in the doorway for a long time. The sky was gold and bruised purple, the kind of light that makes the world look like it's been polished. I cupped my hands around a warm cup of coffee and felt it soak into my skin. The years had carved a map on my face, lines of worry and lines of laughter. I liked the map. It told me where I'd been. Inside, the radio shifted to a slow song, the kind that lets your chest breathe. I took a deep breath and felt the shop settle around me, like a small boat finding its mooring. I thought of Darius and how he'd come back not to undo what he'd done, but to learn to do better. It made me smile. I was proud in a way that had nothing to prove. As I turned the sign to close, I whispered to no one and everyone, sometimes the best revenge isn't rebuilding what they broke. It's rebuilding yourself. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.